plenary session, and I'm very pleased to present to you our keynote speaker, Richard Kearney, who is Charles Daly Professor of Philosophy at Boston College, and he has very rich academic experience worldwide. He's been teaching at University College Dublin, at Sorbonne, and the University of Nice. As you may know, he completed his master at McGill University with a Canadian philosopher, well-known philosopher Charles Taylor, and he did his PhD with Paul Ricoeur at Nanterre. And he was also very active in politics and social sphere, negotiating the peace treatment with Northern Ireland. And there is also an ongoing project, guest book, which is an exchange of different narratives, which is very much related to the topic of today, narrative imagination. I hope Richard Kearney will tell us more about this as well. So I'm very pleased to give the word to our guest star, Richard Kearney. Thank you.
Very much, Chris. And thank you, Rita, and the other organizers for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. I'm aware of the acoustic difficulties, having sat at the back of this room for much of this morning, and how difficult it is for you to hear. There's also kind of a buzzing here which doesn't help, but I hope you can't hear it as loudly as I can. And I also appreciate that it's very hot, but if you open the windows you can't hear, and if you close them you can, and you're very hot. So, that said, I will speak as loud as I can, and if anybody at the back can't hear me, just put up your hand and I will try to articulate louder and better. I'll stand for that reason rather than sitting there, because I probably will be able to pitch my voice better from here. All right, now the talk is on narrative imagination, and what I'm going to do is take three examples of three foundational texts in Western literature: Homer's Odyssey, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and Joyce's Ulysses, which are all stories about addressing and recounting a hurt, a wound, a trauma. The Greek for trauma is wound. And my thesis is that in the writing of these works, they wrote, to quote Joyce, the books of themselves. And that in the process of writing, there was an equivalent of sorts to what Freud called the talking cure. So a subtitle for this paper could be The Writing Cure, as a hypothesis. And how does it relate to the nihil? Well, in this respect, that at the root of these three stories, these three narratives, there is a wound that cannot be spoken, that is silent, that is absent, that is never actually disclosed or revealed in the stories themselves. But it's like Henry James said about his novel, Cherchez la femme, look for the woman in the carpet, look for her that has inspired the work in the filigree, in the shadows, in the margins. You won't find it, but that's what motivates the book. The great works of literature are written about something that cannot be said. It's about speaking the unspeakable. It's impossible to speak it, but it's impossible not to speak it, at least for these authors. And of course, then, this opens up in turn to the whole question of catharsis for the reader, to the extent that the reader is invited into the world of the author, which is, of course, the implied author in the imaginary world of the text itself, the virtual world of the text itself. All right, so I'm going to begin with Joyce, and then work back through the others. Maybe people, do you want to come and sit?
You come closer, as it is.
And if you sit up here, you'll be able to hear better, because there's no microphone that works. All right. Okay. So I start with Joyce, and I'm going to read most of the paper. I will not go over 1 hour. I'll try to stick to about 50 minutes so we have plenty of time for question and answer. But I will read it pretty formally with some parentheses where we can extemporize. All right, so James Joyce, in a letter to his brother Stanislas, on November the 13th, 1906, announces that he has just started a new short story. It's called Ulysses. He came up with the idea, he explains, because of a memory triggered by a recent mugging in a street in Rome. He had just been fired from his job at the bank and drunk all his severance pay, which should have paid the rent and helped provide for his 1-year-old son, Giorgio. On his way home, Joyce was robbed and left lying in the gutter, destitute, despondent, and bleeding. And it was at that very moment that he suddenly remembered something. Being assaulted several years previously, on June 22nd, 1904, in Dublin, and rescued from the gutter by a man called Hunter, quote, Joyce, a cuckolded Jew, who dusted him down and took him home for a cup of cocoa. In true Samaritan fashion, as Joyce put it. This is in his letter to Stanislas, describing the genesis of his short story, Ulysses, which was to become a very long story by the end of the day. This repetition of woundings, Rome 1906 repeating Dublin 1904, triggered a lost memory in Joyce, where an immigrant Jew came to the rescue of a wounded Dubliner and planted a seed of Caritas in his narrative imagination. Now, several weeks after the Rome mugging, Joyce and Nora were given tickets to an opera whose librettist was called Blum. This second moment of pure happenstance, after his humiliating fall in a Roman side street, furnished the name of his paternal protagonist, Leopold Bloom. Thus was born the longest short story ever told, Ulysses, the tale of a father and a son traversing wounds on the way to healing. So my subject, as I mentioned, is the writing cure, question mark. And my questions are the following. How might literature help us work through trauma? How far can narrative catharsis go, and what are its limits? And finally, how might narrative healing differ in the case of little trauma, that is, the existential wounds of birth, loss, and death, which we all experience, and big trauma, war, torture, catastrophe, which is the normal subject for most studies in what today is called trauma studies, particularly in North America with Kathy Caruth and Judith Harmon and so on. I mean, it's war, and this goes back to Freud, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, who was the first really to open the doors to trauma study. My chosen examples, as I mentioned, are Ulysses, itself a story which rewrites two other stories, Shakespeare's Hamlet and Homer's Odyssey, even in the title. All three are stories of fathers and sons, stories of transgenerational trauma, which I will suggest are transmitted and somehow transfigured in the narrative imagination of the stories themselves. That's the hypothesis. In the opening of Joyce's Ulysses, we're told by Hines that it's all about, I quote, the father and the son idea. The son striving to be atoned with the father. End of quote. It doesn't take long for us to realize that the son in question is Stephen, Telemachus, and the father is Bloom, Ulysses. Their paths cross in the middle of the book as Stephen exits and Bloom enters the National Library in Dublin. It's a pivotal scene in which Stephen expounds his central theory of the father-son idea in Hamlet. Stephen's thesis is that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet the year his son, Hamnet, died, and his own father, John Shakespeare, was dying. The play is about the transmission, therefore, of a mortal trauma between fathers and sons. In short, according to Stephen, Daedalus, Shakespeare wrote the book of himself in order to avoid the madness of melancholy, in order to properly mourn his father and his son, Hamlet, in a way that he was unable to do in real life. The play itself thus serves as a symbolic working through of an otherwise irresolvable crisis in which a father, King Hamlet, commands his son, Prince Hamlet, to do something impossible, that is, to remember what cannot be remembered, to tell something that cannot be told. A double injunction, tell it, but I'm not going to tell you what you have to tell. This is an unbearable burden for the young Hamlet. It's an impossible story that he has been enjoined to recount. The double bind of trauma. I quote Catharsis in this paradigmatic definition of trauma, or rather, the narrative of trauma: to speak is impossible, not to speak is impossible. This was taken up by Dowry Laub and others in their studies of Holocaust testimonies. Back to Hamlet. The father, Ghost, King Hamlet is talking to his son, Prince Hamlet, on the battlements of Elsinore. I quote, remember me, says the ghostly father to his son, while at the same time adding, and here's the problem, but that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house, I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul. End of quote. So the ghost's unspeakable secrets, for which he is condemned to the latency of purgatory, those sulphurous and tormenting flames, these very things are precisely what remain secret. I quote, the secret crimes committed in his days of nature, that is his days of youth. Our King Hamlet tells us forbidden tales. In short, the things to be remembered cannot be told in the first place. And this was a standard doctrine belief that those who returned from purgatory were not allowed to speak. They could appear as ghosts, but they could not speak. So Hamlet's father is forbidden to speak about the crimes that he committed, which have put him into purgatory. It's also interesting to note here that Shakespeare's father was Catholic, and there are several Catholic themes, including ghosts, forbidden to Elizabethan Protestants to write about, but which authors could write about if it was on stage. They couldn't talk about it or write about it in public, except in fictional form. And there are all kinds of things, mythic animals, Midsummer's Night's Dreams, all kinds of, beasts and gods and ghosts and everything else could come back, including Catholic doctrines. And Shakespeare himself had a very vexed relationship with his father because he felt, just as Stephen felt the same thing about his father and Joyce about his father, that he in a sense abandoned his father. So Shakespeare had abandoned his dying father, John Shakespeare, and had abandoned his son by leaving Stratford, coming to London to make his name as a great writer. And when he got back to Stratford, having abandoned Anne Hathaway, his wife, and his son Hamlet, the child was already buried. So he never got to see his son being buried, and he missed his death. He never got to mourn his son, which of course is exactly what Hamlet never gets to do with his father, King Hamlet, because he's in Wittenberg with Horatio and misses his father's burial. But we'll come back to that. All right, so we're concerned here, I suggest, with traumas, unspeakable things which we do not possess, but which possess us, like specters, like ghosts. For traumas, as Cathy Caruth writes, quote, describe overwhelming experiences of sudden or catastrophic events in which the response to the event occurs in the often delayed and uncontrolled repetitive occurrence of hallucinations and other intrusive phenomena. End of quote. That's in her seminal book, Trauma. So I think, given that definition, which I really should repeat and go into, but it would take too long, I think Hamlet perfectly qualifies. This Nachträglichkeit, this delayed moment where we revisit the experience which was not experienced and which is lodged in our body and in our carnal memory as something that cannot be remembered because it was never experienced. It's inexperienced experience. So a wound is by definition, trauma is by definition something that cannot be brought into time and history. It is, as Freud says, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle and elsewhere, trauma is a wound that is timeless. It's in the unconscious. So narratives of trauma are attempts to bring the timeless into time, to bring the wound into a scar, if you will. And we'll come back to scars and wounds when we get on to Odysseus shortly. All right. Now, if this reading of Ulysses sounds psychoanalytic, it's because it is. Joyce himself admitted to be deeply interested in Jung and Freud when he was, as he put it, young and easily frightened, a play on being young and easily frightened. And the story is well known of Joyce bringing his daughter Lucia to visit Jung in Zurich, only to be told by Jung that he, Joyce, would be as incurably psychotic as his daughter Lucia if he had not penned Ulysses. Writing his book of transgenerational trauma, of Ulysses and Telemachus, of King and Prince Hamlet, of Stephen and Bloom, was, it seemed, the writing cure for Joyce's own trauma. It was the book of himself. And Joyce concedes the creative liaison between narrative imagination and life when he confesses it's a brave man who would invent something that never happened. Now, I'm operating here not with some crude kind of intentional fallacy or biographical realism. I'm operating broadly with the hermeneutic model of action, text, action. Narrative comes from life and returns to life, and life in the first instance, mimesis 1, is already prefigurative, pre-narrative. Then narrative, textual narrative proper, is a configuration of those prefigured possibilities for narrativity, and then action is when we, the readers, traverse the text, hermeneutically appropriated to ourselves, our understanding, our lives, and refigure our life of action accordingly. So I'm operating on that basic hermeneutic model. What happens in Ulysses, in many respects, fundamental respects, key respects, happened to Joyce. He was the manic magpie who, by his own admission, gleaned every word of his story from the stories of history, personal or collective, which he overheard or heard. His fiction is haunted by what he called the nightmares of history, the mute mothers of memory that cry out to be heard and spoken and written. Phantasmal hauntings torment the young Stephen with what he calls again bite of inwit, a term taken from Beowulf, the first great works of English literature, Old English, Anglo-Saxon literature, which means guilt, again bite. It's the bite that comes back again of inwit, wit as wissen, conscience. These hauntings, revisit him obsessively, guiltily, ineluctably. Both Hamlet and Ulysses relate such ghostings of narrative memory. Stephen is haunted by the ghost of his mother who keeps coming back, Hamlet by the ghost of his father. As for Freud, back to psychoanalysis, no such meeting took place, as took place between Joyce and Jung. But I sometimes imagine Joyce reading Freud's seminal theory of trauma in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published by Freud in 1920 as Joyce was completing Ulysses, which was published in 1922. And as I do so, I wonder, when Joyce came to the Fort Da scene, if it didn't confirm his own theory of catharsis in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Recall how Freud witnessed, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, recall how Freud witnessed his grandson Ernst's first spoken words. Gone, back again. Fort da. While playing with a wooden cotton reel, which he made vanish under his curtained cot and then reappear again in imitation of his mother's coming and going from the house. A cause of unbearable separation anxiety for the young child, Freud's grandchild. In Freud's famous account of little Ernst's two-syllable tale, Fort da, invented by the child to compensate for the little trauma of his parents' absence. I say little trauma because this is not war, this is a child separated from its mother, or its patients. His mother was out of the house, his father was at war, this is 1914, and Freud was babysitting, and actually quite a clinically cruel babysitter because he let little Ernst cry himself into a tizzy before then little Ernst starts playing with this spool and saying his first words, Fort da. Now, of course, Freud would be there for his grandchild's first words, wouldn't he? And he would therefore have his great insight into trauma. Curiously, this little passage in Beyond the Pleasure Principle comes right in the middle of his discussion of war trauma, because he wrote the book Beyond the Pleasure Principle as an attempt to work out why people had dreams and narratives that kept returning to scenes of incredible pain, unbearable pain, namely shell shock. Right? So war trauma impelled and enjoined Freud to ask the question, is there an impulse greater than eros, the pleasure principle, which might be a desire for death, for pain, to return to the void? And he wrote the book accordingly. But in the middle of this study of war trauma that then led on to his great expose of eros and thanatos in 1920, Joyce interpolates this little scene about his grandson. And interestingly, and it doesn't fit into the narrative of the book, but interestingly, he did this in 1920, a month after the death of his daughter, Sophie, who was, of course, Ernst's mother. Right. So in writing about his grandson's attempt to invent a game of language, narrative imagination, if you will, of faute da, to compensate for an unbearable loss, the separation from the mother, Joyce is writing this book and this passage in this book as his own faute da, to compensate for the loss of his own daughter. He was absolutely inconsolable when she died. She was a favourite daughter, and this really gutted him. And there he is, he's writing about the death of the same woman, his daughter, that his grandson was, in his way, learning to learn with the loss of in that little game, faute da. All right, to return to the text. So, in other words, might not both Freud and Joyce have witnessed the magical power of words to work through wounds, albeit at very different levels? Right, so now I'm imagining Joyce reading Freud, discussing this break between a child and a parent and a child. In both instances, are we not witnessing a working through as writing through? Durcharbeiten as a writing through. Durcharbeiten as narrative imagination. More precisely, when Freud wrote of his grandson's loss of his mother, was he not also writing about his own loss of his daughter, the same person, Sophie Freud, as I just mentioned? My suggestion here is that the mirror play of Sophie Freud's disappearance, enacted between her father Freud and her son Ernst, is a microdrama of transgenerational trauma with a small t. It signals a crossing of identifications where Freud is at once Sophie's father and son, writing the book of himself, as Joyce puts it, so as to mourn a departed loved one, a lost object, Sophie. My corollary suggestion is that James Joyce may have found writerly resonances in Freud's therapeutic narrative of faute da, the longest short story ever told, echoing the shortest short story ever told, Ulysses echoing faute da. This hypothesis is, of course, fantasy, an act of narrative imagination, if you will, but Joyce was a voracious reader, and he does have his Finnegan's Wake narrator boast, I can soup una lose myself anytime I want. Joyce was fascinated by psychoanalysis, and of course spent part of his life writing Finnegan's Wake in Zurich. So to return to Ulysses, when Stephen tells us that Hamlet is the story of Shakespeare's father-son relationship, he is echoing his relationship with his own fathers, Mr. Dedalus and Bloom. And this story, within a story, is, please bear with me, itself a parody of Homer's original story of Ulysses and Telemachus. In other words, we are dealing here with stories within stories within stories. Fathers and sons repeating, reliving, and perhaps to some extent relieving trauma. Narrative imagination as catharsis. But not catharsis understood as closure or completion. Some easy resolution, beginning, middle, end. We get to the end, we're all solved, we're all purged, we're all happy. Rather, narrative imagination as impossible story. Storytelling which forever fails to cure trauma, but never fails to try to heal it. You can't cure trauma, but you can try to heal it. You can't cure the wound, but you can try to heal the scar. And it's at the level of writing and scarring that a certain catharsis may take place. So it's in this very effort itself, and in this very effort itself, to cure the incurable by healing scars, there is what Aristotle calls, and Joyce agrees with him, pleasure. The pleasurable purgation of pity and fear. If we have time, we'll come back to what Aristotle means by that precisely in his Poetics. So, let's go back now to the beginning. Homer's Ulysses. It's a standard motif of Greek myth that sons act like fathers before them, like father, like son, and so on ad infinitum, until someone says, stop. That someone is the true storyteller who transposes the regressive repetition of trauma in life into a cathartic repetition in narrative. So repetition backwards becomes, to borrow from Kierkegaard, repetition forward. Think of the great cyclical myths. We're still in Greece. Zeus castrating Saturn, castrating Uranus. Orestes reiterating the curse of the house of Atreus. Or perhaps most famously, Oedipus repeating the deeds of his father Laios. Recall, Laios raped the son of his host Pelops, thereby committing the equivalent of incest and the betrayal of hospitality. His double transgression replicates the curse of his own father, Labdacus, and is repeated by Oedipus in the next generation. This repetition is called, of fate and destiny, is called Ate. The continuing narrative lineage comes under the heading of the House of Labdacus and involves a recurring acting out of unspoken traumata, Greek for wounds, and unspoken traumata. Levi-Strauss has remarked in Structural Anthropology how the three names of patrilinear descent in the Oedipus story, namely Labdacus, lame, Laios, left-sided, Oedipus, swollen-footed, all refer to wounds which cause difficulties in walking. This fact, he suggests, which is symptomatic of a transfer of trauma over 3 generations, or 4 if you include Antigone, and wish to open up the discussion of fathers and sons to fathers and daughters, and by extension to contemporary feminist readings. I think an excellent idea, but work for another day. But in question and answer, I'd be very interested to come back to that. The only solution to this curse in the House of Labdacus of cyclical repetition is the conversion of the untold wound into some form of telling. In this case, the symbolic implotment of Oedipus's tragic narrative. Only this, says Levi-Strauss, following Aristotle, can bring some sort of catharsis which suspends, through the purging of pity and fear, the compulsive acting out of mute trauma. The basic thesis, in sum, for both Levi-Strauss and for Aristotle, is that myths are machines for the purging of wounds, for the purging of our deepest and potentially most pathological emotions and passions, pity and fear. Narratives, mythic narratives, are strategies for resolving at a symbolic level what remains irresolvable and incurable at the level of lived empirical experience. So human existence is cursed by a tragic because impossible desire to escape the trauma of our autochthonous origins, our mortality, our finitude, our boundedness to death. This is Levi-Strauss. That is to say, the desire to buck our finitude, to deny death. In the Oedipus cycle, this tragic curse is epitomized as noted by the patrilinear names for wounds that bind us to the earth. Difficulties in walking. We're bound to our earthly origins and limits. And the poetic role of mythos mimesis, that comprises tragic drama, as Aristotle notes, is to narrate our heroic desires to transcend our terrestrial nature. So Cadmus kills the dragon, Oedipus defeats the Sphinx, and so on. But our desires are ultimately impossible. We are scarred by contrary and irreconcilable fidelities to earth and to sky, to immanence and to transcendence, to finitude and the desire for the infinite, matter and spirit, nature and culture. We are divided, says Levi-Strauss, between these binary opposites. So for Levi-Strauss, great mythic narratives, beginning with the synchronic myths of La Pensée Sauvage, are attempts to procure cathartic relief by balancing these binary opposites in symbolic constellations, or what he calls mythemes. In other words, what is impossible in reality becomes possible in fiction. So how might this reading relate to the father-son story of Ulysses and Telemachus? Let me say a word about Homer's version and then proceed to Joyce's. Ooh, we got some competition out there, haven't we? Odysseus is condemned to act out the wound of his own failure, his own existential finitude again and again. Note the name Oedipus means son of pain. And Oedipus is named accordingly by his grandfather, Autolycus, who was an inflictor of pain on others. He was a thief and a plunderer and a tyrant, and he worked with Hermes, his partner in crime, and his grandson, when he was born, was called the son of pain. Now it's in the middle voice, Oedipus, which can mean either the recipient of pain or the giver of pain. So is he going to be a giver of pain like his grandfather Autolycus, or is he going to be the receiver of pain? Because as we're going to discover in the last act of this narrative, he received a wound with his grandfather as a child when hunting a boar. Now we don't know this until the very last part of the book, when he returns to Ithaca and his nurse is not recognized first and foremost by Emmaus, his old friend, or by indeed his own son, Telemachus at first. He's recognized by his dog, who can smell with a kind of a hermeneutic canine carnal flair the stranger come disguised as a beggar man. Telemachus is expecting a great god to return, and to return shining with glorious armor and divine splendor and glory. The word Argian is used several times. But in fact, it's not the glorious Ulysses, it's the dog, Argos, and Homer plays on Argos and Argian, who in his dying simplicity recognizes Odysseus, his master. And then the nurse, Eurycleia, by touching the wound that nobody else has seen and that Athena has not been able to hide. In her disguising of Odysseus, it's the one thing that is not hidden, right? If you like, two things: his smell that the dog flares in a carnal hermeneutic, and then the touching of the wound. So it's smell and touch, and we might add a third, taste, because Telemachus finally recognizes his father when they sit down and eat in the swineherd's hut. And of course Joyce makes a lot of this because Emmaus is the name of the swineherd in whose hut they share the simple food. And Joyce in Ulysses is going to relate that to Emmaus, where Christ shares food with the disciples after his death and his return, if you will. So the primary senses, right, of touch, Eurycleia touching the wound, the hidden wound that he carries since his childhood, smell, the dog, Argos, and taste, between father and son. These are the three moments of recognition. After a story of méconnaissance, you finally have reconnaissance. And I'll return to that in a moment. So Odysseus had absented himself from the wounds of his birth and upbringing, his mortality, his autochthonous origins in Ithaca, sailing off to heroic glory in Troy. But his attempts to become an immortal warrior are constantly countered by reminders of his mortality, the brutal carnage of Troy and subsequent calamities. And the breaking of the lure of Calypso is also central to this ongoing disillusionment. Originally leaving Ithaca as an aspirant hero, Odysseus returns as a beggar, a lowly outcast only recognized by his dog Argos and the scar on his thigh by his nurse Eurycleia. It's significant that Eurycleia only touches her master's scar after a detailed narrative about how Ulysses received the original wound in the childhood hunting accident with his grandfather Autolycus, as I just mentioned. Yet another example of transgenerational trauma. Note that this narrative working through, leading up to the final healing touch, takes all of 77 lines. In other words, the scene, this has been written about at great length and wonderfully by Eric Orbach in his famous book, mimesis, it opens with a chapter called Odysseus' Scar. This scene, this pivotal scene, kept to the last minute, is the scene where we hear the childhood of Odysseus. We know nothing about it for the whole book until we come to the story of his wounding, his childhood wounding with his grandfather, and therefore we learn how he was named, Oedipus, and how he received the scar. So, the touching of the scar is simultaneous with the recounting of his life. His narrative identity is revealed narratively by the nurse remembering the story. So there's the touching of the wound, the telling of the story in narrative memory, narrative imagination, and the recognition of the name. A parallel that comes to mind, but I don't want to go into it here, is it's also at the end of Shakespeare's Hamlet that Hamlet discovers through his nurse and minder Yorick, the dead Yorick of course, where he came from, and that Yorick was his true father who looked after him and not his natural father, King Hamlet, who that day, the day of Hamlet's birth, had killed Fortinbras's father. That's one of the many secrets hidden away in the text and unspoken throughout the text. But that's where the intimation comes by the gravediggers. So the gravediggers and Yorick serve the same role of returning to the wound, returning to the secret, returning to his naming, the day he was born, in the same way that Emmaus and the swineherd's hut and Euryclea play a similar role in Ulysses. But as I say, that's another parenthesis. Back to Ulysses. Homer's Ulysses. So Telemachus, expecting a triumphant victor to return, does not recognize at first Ulysses, his own father. He's so fixated on his great expectations of the father that he does not see the scar on his father's body. He's blinded by illusory images. Delusions abound. When he finally acknowledges that the mortified stranger before him is in fact his real father, they sit down together, as I mentioned, in the swineherd's hut and eat. Simple sharing of the food of the earth, squatting in a den, is how they finally come together as host and guest, hospitality as antidote to the hostile curse of fate. Ate. Now the word Homer uses here for scar is oulin. This is a term often associated in Greek literature with trauma, as for example in Plato's Gorgias, 524, oulas en to somati hypotraumaton, where oulin means both trace and scar. Again, while the wound is timeless and cannot be experienced, the scar appears in time. It is a carnal trace which can change and alter over time, though it never disappears. So, scars are written on the body and are forms of proto-writing. And narrative catharsis is a process of working through such carnal tracings and etchings and writings. Put simply, while the wounds remain timeless and unrepresentable, scars are the marks left on the flesh to be seen, touched, told, and read. Scars are engraved wounds that may or may not be healed. And I'll return to this if time permits. So how in the light of all this does Homer's epic compare with Joyce's parody? Quite apart from the fact that we have leaped 3,000 years from a cold synchronic literature to a hot diachronic one, from ancient to modern if you wish, the father-son idea repeats itself. But the repetition is forward, not backward. Now, when Joyce repeats Homer, he's not going back. He's repeating the Homeric story forward. That is what writing can do. Give a future to the past. Joyce's narrative imagination then invites a release from the haunting cycle of trauma. The story of Stephen and Bloom recounts their respective efforts to escape the loss of absent parents, Stephen's mother and father, and a departed son, Bloom's prematurely departed son Rudy. They both seek a new bond of spiritual paternity, filiality. But they cannot find it for as long as they remain captive to their illusions of what this should be. Stephen's fantasy of perfect fusion and Bloom's obsession with his lost son. Bloom seeks a perfect lost son. Stephen's seeks a perfect lost father. They want to spiritualize the absent son and the absent father. But only when they accept, spiritualize in the sense of apotheosize, fantasize, only when they accept their condition of wounded, finite beings, Stephen breaking with the literary meat of Dublin, Bloom returning home to Molly, only then can arise a love beyond illusion. What Joyce calls, I quote, as Bloom curls up in the bed at Molly's feet at the end of the day, he does so, he returns to her with less envy than equanimity, less jealousy than abnegation. Remember, Molly has spent the day cavorting with her lover, Blazes Boylan. And Bloom knows this. Bloom is the couple de Jew. But he comes back and lies with Molly with less envy than equanimity, less jealousy than abnegation. And it's at that moment, of course, that she then has the memory of the first kiss with Bloom on Ho's head, with which the story ends. Okay, so only then can arise a love beyond illusion. Surrogate father, Bloom, and surrogate son, Stephen, exchange stories of failure and mourn lost illusions when they return to Bloom's house and have coffee. Such love beyond loss is only a hint, of course, a glint in Molly's matinal eye. Because the day starts again at the end of the book. It begins in the morning, it ends in the morning. But it is enough perhaps of a narrative catharsis to give the reader hope in another day, in beginning again, or as Joyce puts it, child man weary, man child in the womb. So, to return one last time to Hamlet, we might ask this. Why does Stephen Dedalus choose this particular story to work out his theory of the father-son idea? Let's take a closer look. The ghost of King Hamlet asks his son, as we said at the beginning, to remember something that couldn't be remembered. So, as we noted, the play begins with a tale that cannot be told, a testimony that cannot be transmitted. And it thereby breaks with the age-old sacred tradition of deathbed blessings passed from fathers to sons, particularly in the history plays of Shakespeare and others. It's the father king who passes on the blessing and the benediction and the birthright and the primogeniture to the son. This breakage between generations, between father and son, is an example of what Dory Lau calls the collapse of witnessing. Hamlet, we saw, knows his father is condemned to flames for a secret sin committed in his father's youth. But his father, as mentioned, is forgotten by this very same sin to say what it is that is from telling his story. So, I repeat, the double injunction, father says to son, remember me, but I can't tell you what to remember. Thus here, as in so many ancient narratives of trauma, blind acts of murder and incest are encrypted rather than confessed. Whence the inheritance of the wound as a mark in one's flesh, what Hamlet famously calls the mole of nature, which one inherits with one's birth. And if you remember that Hamlet was born the day that his father killed King Fortinbras, this has an historical resonance as well, of course, as a theological one. The mole of nature is another name for original sin. Hamlet spends the entire play trying to, as he puts it, catch the conscience of the king, deploying the antique disposition of mask and subterfuge, pun and quip, play and wit, so that he might, as he puts it, by indirection, play, jokes, allusions, by indirection find direction out. Who killed my father? What did my father do to have been sent to purgatory, and so on. But working through takes time. It takes patience. 5 full acts. Truth only ultimately reveals itself when Hamlet succeeds in abandoning his illusions about a perfect father and accepts that he, no less than his father before him, is a failed, forked, mortal, finite thing. Henceforth, the readiness is all. Now, I'm making an allusion there to the scene where Hamlet goes to his mother's boudoir and takes a picture of his father. And he says, look, here's Hyperion. Here's a demigod. Here's the hero of heroes, my real father. And here is Claudius, my stepfather, who is a satyr. Hyperion, a satyr. And he demonizes Claudius and he completely adulates his father. And throughout the play there is this sense that he missed his father's funeral, so he can't mourn him. But he also has this completely illusory imago about who the father is. And it's only when this is ultimately shattered and he realizes that his father was probably no better than Claudius, that he can in all humility tell his story. We'll come to that in a moment. We're nearly there. This surrender of idealized imagos of the father reaches its climax in the famous graveyard scene, which I mentioned, when Hamlet comes to realize that the father who loved him as a child and bore him daily on his shoulders was not, as he'd imagined, his natural father, King Hamlet, but the long-buried court jester, poor Yorick. Only then is Hamlet the son ready to act according to something beyond himself, what he calls a divinity beyond our ends, acknowledging his own mortal condition. Now the readiness is all. And here, as in King Lear, wisdom comes from the lowest of creatures. Hamlet the son dies, the play hints, poisoned by the same sword that Hamlet the father used to poison King Fortinbras on the day Hamlet was born. And to follow this hint of the grave scene, it was this secret poisoning which led to the cycle of further killings of kings by kings, Fortinbras, Hamlet, Claudius, etc., and sons by sons, Hamlet, Laertes, and almost Fortinbras. But of course, Hamlet stops the revenge cycle of this compulsive repetition of trauma by refusing to kill Fortinbras. So what we witness are inhumations and exhumations, cryptings and decryptings, secrets of the grave whispered through the mouths of fools, the gravediggers. Yorick. Now this fatal circle of repetition comes to an end, that is the revenge cycle, comes to an end when Hamlet himself becomes the sacrificial symptom of cyclical acting out and exposes the wound in his own body where the sword enters. Note that the fatal wounds of King Hamlet's body were never seen or touched by his son as scars, for the poisoned king was, I quote, to his grave untimely sent, his prematurely decomposing body having to be interred without ceremony before Hamlet returned. So Hamlet never sees the corpse of his father, just as Shakespeare, as I mentioned, never saw the corpse of his son, Hamlet. So the wounds were never witnessed as scars. Once again, we find a collapse of witnessing which makes for a traumatic delay. Hamlet cannot act. He's always putting it off, the procrastinating gesture. For 5 acts. I mean, Hamlet is a play where nothing happens 5 times. Somebody said, I think it was Vivian Mercier, that Beckett's Waiting for Godot was a play in 2 acts where nothing happened twice. Well, Shakespeare's a play in 5 acts where nothing happens 5 times. And when it finally does, after much delay, Nachträglichkeit, because that's how trauma works, always by delay, finally there is the working through of the wound as scar, and then he can tell his story. Or as he says to Horatio, absent thee from felicity a while to tell my story. Felicity meaning happiness. Don't have a good time until you've written my story. Who's Horatio? Well, it's Shakespeare who writes the story. It's us, the readers, who have to write the story for ourselves. So traumas are in Hamlet revisited as ghosts, coming back again and again and again after the event, revenant après coup, Nachträglichkeit, until we face the nothing, the nil, the null punkt. If we don't face the nothing, the void, the bottomless wound, the bottomless grave, if we don't face it and give it a story and a name, the nothing becomes everything in disguise, in deception. Without reconnaissance of the nothing, there is only méconnaissance. And for nothing here, you can read mortality, death, finitude, what Levi-Strauss calls our autochthonous origin, our ontological wound as finite human beings. Levinas talks about le traumatisme originel. Well, le traumatisme originel is in many respects begins with birth. The fact that you were born, the fact that there is separation is already a trauma, a cut, a wound. But as I say, small trauma, not big trauma. This is not genocide, this is not Nagasaki, this is not torture, but mini traumas, as Freud recognized in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, have the same temporal imaginative structure and narrative structure as big traumas. And that's in particular what interests me actually. What interests me. So, this phenomenon of delay is extremely relevant, I think, for an understanding of our own contemporary culture's fear around dying and death. In parenthesis here, I'm talking about foundational stories, but it's very relevant to the stories that abound in our contemporary culture. We don't have to look to the great classics. I choose them because of their paradigmatic quality. In former times, mourners were encouraged to have direct and sustained funerary witness of dead bodies before burial. Think of the Irish wake, for example, where you sit with the corpse for 6 days. And this culture of death denial in contemporary culture, even today increasingly in Ireland, where everything is whisked off, the body is whisked off to a mortuary and then it comes back more beautiful than it ever was in real life. This is manifest in all kinds of symptomatic avoidance behaviour faced with the wounds of disabled or otherwise scarred persons, including dead persons. To take just one example, might not a mass social media phenomenon like Facebook, where we prepared a face to meet the faces that we meet, to quote Eliot, and to meet in a virtual climate of mandatory cheer, might this not also prove to be deep down a book of ghosts? Very few people cry on Facebook or tell the story of their wound or their pain. Look at the pictures, they're all smiling. They're all having a great time. Let me sum up. Because the son did not witness the father going down into his grave, this absence was engraved in his flesh. The loss, the lack, the gap of the empty grave, the missingness, the void, all this was encrypted as a suppressed right of memory, waiting 5 full acts of procrastination, Nachträglichkeit, to be retrieved. And this is perhaps the reason why T.S. Eliot described Hamlet as an artistic failure, if also the most written about drama in Western culture. It's also the reason why Andre Green describes Hamlet as the greatest literary performance of unconscious trauma and recovery, to which psychoanalysts have been endlessly drawn like kittens to a ball of wool. In fact, Hamlet is the figure most written about in Western literature after Jesus Christ. Let me just say that when I take the 3 classic paradigmatic stories, as I've done, Shakespeare, Homer, Joyce, it's not confined to these authors. The paradigm of wounding and scarring, of the unspeakable and the impossible need to speak about it, the fathers and sons and transgenerational gaps and collapses of witnessing, all of these themes are alive and well in our own contemporary stories, including those of popular culture. I mean, if one looks deeply at The Lord of the Rings or The Matrix or the Batman series or the Alien series, you will find very, very similar motifs and themes and temporalities at work. And this, of course, chimes very much with what Lévi-Strauss says in La Pensée Sauvage, that there are stories that are repeated over time. We may think we've progressed from all that, but the story of Cinderella is being told countlessly in every second, and that goes back to cinders, ashes which are horizontal and vertical, the lowest of the low rising to the highest of the high, which is the story of Cinderella. But it comes, as Lévi-Strauss shows, from nearly all cultures, which he analyzes comparatively in La Pensée Sauvage. And you go to Pretty Woman and you've got the same story. Cinderella's alive and well, and she's now called Julia Roberts playing somebody else. So the points are the same. This is not like, let's go back to modernist or classical literary culture and get away from our awful postmodern, virtual culture of simulation and simulacrum and everything else. That sort of complaint is not, and kind of rearguard action, nostalgia for the great works of literature, is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying in the great works of literature, in the great myths, we find paradigms of storytelling around wounds and scars that are also available daily in the stories we tell ourselves, to ourselves and to others, in order to explain ourselves to ourselves and to others, and in order to hide ourselves from ourselves and from others. So my reference to Facebook is not sort of some attempt to sort of go back 200 years and let's all read Joyce and Shakespeare. I just mentioned that in passing. because the image is not just the great literary image, it's also the contemporary cinematic virtual image. Perhaps we could come back to that in question. In any case, in short, fathers and sons, sons and fathers. Eventually, it is Hamlet's own sacrificial surrender which enables the play's own fatherless son, Prince Fortinbras, to live on, to survive the fatal curse which ghosted the whole revenge cycle for generations. Hamlet's dying words to Horatio say it all: absent thee from felicity a while to tell my story. End of quote. The story that could not be told is finally told, though it took 5 acts and it's not Hamlet who's going to tell it. It is by implication Horatio, though it's off stage and off screen because we don't hear it, but we're witnessing it. The story that could not be told is finally told, and the closing words of the 5th act are delivered by Fortinbras himself, finally set free by Hamlet's sacrifice to recover the cryptid memory of his father, his own father, King Fortinbras. He says, I have certain rights of memory to this kingdom, which now to claim advantage doth invite me. In other words, in these final words of the play, memory and story, history and story, cross in mourning. And if there is catharsis of narrative imagination, it is indeed a purging of pity and of fear. So a final epilogue. I said I'd come in under an hour, and I will. And that gives me 5 minutes. Much more could be said here about the cathartic role of narrative imagination. Whoops. There is Aristotle's theory of cathartic affect in the Poetics, and Joyce's rewriting of it in A Portrait of the Artist. There is the difference between catharsis as it affects the author, as I've been talking about in this paper, and the audience, us. It's on the latter that Aristotle focuses when he talks about the purgation of the spectator's emotions of pity and fear. He's not talking about Euripides and Sophocles, he's talking about us, the spectators. So what I've been saying about Joyce and Shakespeare and Homer applies equally to the readers. Then, secondly, I've got some quotations from Joyce here on purgation and Aristotle, but I'm leaving that behind. Then there is the question, which we could address, but I don't have time, but I'd love to take it on in question and answer with you. There's the question of the respective therapeutic roles of imagination, cognition, and emotion. Paul Ricard looks into this, for example, in his rereading of Aristotelian Catharsis in Volume 1 of Time and Narrative. And there is crucially the difference between catharsis in lowercase trauma, the originally traumas of birth, loss, and death, and in uppercase trauma, torture, rape, abuse, catastrophe, and genocide. Again, we can discuss that. These latter examples of big trauma often involve such appalling terror, what Freud called Schreck, that several experts in trauma studies claim, among them Herman, Beryl Lang, Claude Lanzmann, that no catharsis is possible or indeed appropriate. Should we have catharsis about genocide, testimonies, and stories? Spielberg, when he made Schindler's List, said yes, essential to have healing, a healing memory around the retelling, albeit through fictional form, which is very important too, of the Holocaust story, Schindler's List. Lanzmann said, when he made Shoah, no. Any form of catharsis is a betrayal of the pain, the incurable, unhealable pain of Auschwitz. It's like the poor Clares and the Carmelites who want to come and build a little convent in Auschwitz and pray for the forgiveness of everybody. No. There was a backlash against that by many of the Jewish survivors. Said, no, it's not about pardon, it's not about healing, it's not about catharsis. This is a tragic case of irredeemable, unforgivable, unspeakable evil. Let it rest as such. So again, if time, it'd be interesting to come back to Lanzmann's view on how you represent the Holocaust versus as trauma, as major trauma, versus Spielberg. I tried to do this in a chapter in my little book on stories, but I'd be very happy to return to that too, because it raises a central question, which is the limits of narrative catharsis. Are there some things that, as trauma, simply cannot be retrieved, relived, and in some sense healed or transfigured? As I say, the limits of narrative healing are a very real question for me, and I'd be happy to come back to it. So I'd like to repeat in closing that we need to think about the genuinely cathartic role of trauma stories as requiring open narratives that never end, rather than closed narratives that presume to wish away wounds rather than working through them as scars. Trauma narratives are by their very nature truncated, gapped, fractured, inconclusive, impossible. They may be great stories, but they can never offer terminal solutions. There are no total cures. Writings can only work through traumas as traces, revisit them as hauntings. They can never fully retrieve such experiences or tell the full story. In the transposition from inexpressible wound to written scar, there's something lost, always in translation. Why? Because the wound is precisely that which could never be properly registered or recorded in the first place. It was because it was too much that trauma repeats itself as lack. Too much to be registered, recognized, experienced. That's why it is lodged in us as the nihil, the lack. Trauma narratives are scabs over the cavities left by inexperienced experience. So recall in conclusion our three stories. The trauma inherited by Hamlet, namely his father's murder by Claudius on top of his father's sin committed on Hamlet's birthday, is something hinted at in the play. It's never openly stated. Moreover, the fact that his father's death and burial are missed by Hamlet, who was absent in Wittenberg, is a further token of inexperienced experience. And this is linked in its own murky way with Hamlet's mother's incest with Claudius. There are secrets everywhere, plays within plays, cipherings and decipherings, which is why Andre Green, Nicholas Abraham and other psychoanalysts have hunted obsessively to untangle the mystery of Hamlet without ever succeeding. Why? Because Shakespeare leaves it cryptid. Shakespeare's drama engraves traces of buried trauma, which Hamlet resolves to exhume, as in the gravedigger's scene, but never finally exposes. Many bodies are rotten and rotting in the state of Denmark, from beginning to end, from its eponymous king to the disappeared Polonius, but they are all hidden away. Polonius, under the stairs. You can whiff him as you're going up the stairs, says Hamlet. Behind walls and wainscotings, behind lies and disguises, screens and seams, there is the trauma. All we have are odours. Where's Argos? Ashes, illusions, oblique ciphers less deciphered than played with, like cotton reels in the Fortdas story or the gallows wit of the gravediggers. And as they are played with, they are also played out in imitated suffering and action, mythos, mimesis. In this sense, the plays, that is, Hamlet's very success, is its failure. Hamlet's manic, melancholic words swarm like bees over the black hole of an empty hive, but they cannot ever fill in the gaping wound. Only at best can they conjure or confront the invisible ghosts within. The narrative catharsis comes ultimately not from the cognition of discovery. We never know exactly what happened, just as we never get to the bottom of Odysseus' wound and the relationship between him and the grandfather and the curse that is inherited of pain from the grandfather. We never get to the root of Joyce's wound, or Stephen's wound, or Bloom's wound. There's something unsaid behind the stories that makes the stories these incredible weavings and textings and texturings of writing over the nihil, over the unspeakable pain. Failing to fully acknowledge his father's unspoken crimes, although they're laconically mentioned in Act 1 as I cited, Hamlet nonetheless comes to acknowledge the limits of his own finite, humble existence. That's the crucial lesson of the grave scene. Indeed, the fact that King Hamlet's hidden story, the real reason he's condemned to purgatory, remains buried throughout the play, only returning as spectral intimation, itself performs Prince Hamlet's inability to discover his own story, and by implication, our own inability as audience to discover the unfathomable story of the play. Hamlet is a tragedy of trauma. It recounts the impossibility of saying the unsayable. Similar issues of unsayability surround the unspoken traumas of Stephen and Odysseus. There are signs here too, but they are equally cryptic. Stephen's overdetermined guilt, Odysseus' occluded scar. And we as readers may in turn hypothesize about the nature of the various authors' own engraved wounds. There are dozens of books written about Shakespeare's wounds, Joyce's wounds, Homer's wounds, but you'll never get to the bottom. One might ask, what Homeric trauma, personal or collective, lies behind the long-forgotten story of Odysseus' infantile wound? How deep was Shakespeare's shame at missing his own son's funeral, his currying favour with the barbarous Queen Elizabeth, his abandoning his father's forbidden Catholicism? And to give Joyce the last word, what traumas, little or big, may have been reactivated by his incidental mugging in a Roman night street? Guilt at abandoning his mother and family, the painful break with his city and culture, or perhaps, farther back still, the untold historical rupture inherited from the Great Irish Famine, with its extinctions, evictions, and exiles. I have a long section here which I'm going to skip because I've now reached my hour, about the importance of the ghosts of the famine in Ulysses, which is never picked up by the critics or commentators. But if you read between the lines, the ghosts of the famine ghost the story of Ulysses. If somebody's interested, we can come back to some of those texts, but I'm leaving it for now. So to sum up, final paragraph. Joyce's narrative of his native psyche shows that past wounds are never completely past, no matter how much one prays. The psychic palimpsest of personal and historical abandonment finds expression in the ineradicable wounds of what Stephen calls, I quote, banishment from the heart, banishment from the home. Joyce identified similar experiences of sundering in both Shakespeare and Homer, whose traumatized heroes also carry scars of exile and injury. Like his literary predecessors before him, Joyce grafted stories onto histories, forgotten, repressed, occulted, or stolen. His narratives were secreted from those nightmares of history which, by Joyce's own admission, made his writing, I quote, the last word in stolen telling. Storytelling, stolen telling. Ulysses is, I wager, it's my hermeneutic wager from the beginning of the end of this paper, a tireless literary effort to awaken cathartically from such historic nightmares by restoring forfeited stories and bringing ghosts back to life. It is, in short, a work of mourning and recovery, a writing which translates wounds into scars, flesh into fiction, a working through of trauma. Thank you.